The Balkanization of Utopia. Quote, until he has witnessed an Easter march, the average citizen can have no idea of the number of groups hell-bent on the balkanization of Utopia and the diversity of magazines and badges which they produce. Yesterday, Ilford Liberation Group, the Fellowship Party, and the Anarchists were groups for the connoisseur, while the Young Communist League, the district committees of London area communist parties, and the Young Socialists provided more familiar forms of dissent. End quote. Guardian, April 19th, 1965. The press, the police, and representatives of the established political parties must share a certain incredulous surprise on occasions like Aldermaston, for there, surfacing into broad daylight, emerging from the anonymity of their daily lives, are literally dozens of different political or anti-political groupings, scores of rank-and-file papers, subversive to various degrees of the established order, and thousands upon thousands of individuals with strongly felt opinions of their own, united in their opposition to the bomb and in their determination to take responsibility for their own actions. What vision of the future do these people hold? The categories of traditional politics are quite inadequate to define them. These crowds are unlikely to be demonstrating for either Mr. Wilson or Mr. Golan's, quote, alternatives, end quote, to the established order. This mass of humanity on the road, quote, hell-bent on the balkanization of Utopia, end quote, must be a bureaucrat's nightmare. The procession, as is well known, is filmed and photographed from every angle, dissected, enlarged, submitted to the most refined technologies of identification known to the special branch. This rabble, this horde of potential troublemakers must be identified, their affiliations established, the files kept accurate and up to date. How much easier it would be to treat them all as, quote, Reds, or, quote, pacifists, or, quote, communists, or, quote, anarchists, without having to worry about the finer shades of doctrinal difference, without having to document this massive dissent. But that wouldn't do in the scientific age. The clerks and computers must be kept busy. Tagged, the rebels must be. Who is, quote, dangerous, and, quote, and who is, quote, daft, end quote. Who owes allegiance to Moscow, and who to Transport House. Who lives in the past, and who in the present. Who believes in nonviolence, and who doesn't. Who believes in Parliament, and who does not. Who are the, quote, resolutionaries, end quote, and who are the, quote, resolutionaries, end quote. And how the hell can we make sure their beliefs remain static and that they won't split and shift allegiance and bugger up the card index? Who are sheep? Who are goats? And in which pigeonhole do we put the hybrids? The politicians must view it much as the police does. Why don't all these people just stay at home and leave it to us? Why don't they trust their elders and betters? Why aren't they happy just to vote for us every few years? Why do they argue so much and in the streets too? And is all this just the top of the iceberg? How many others today think as they do? How many will tomorrow? Could this scruffy lot be the, quote, don't knows, end quote, of the Gallup polls? Are these the solid core of non-voters? How often does their, quote, don't know, end quote, mean, quote, won't tell, end quote? And how often does, quote, won't tell, end quote, mean, quote, fuck the lot of you, end quote? Why, oh why, won't all these people accept our, quote, realistic, end quote, parliamentary alternatives? Why don't they leave complicated things like their own life and death to the professional politicians? If they must have their utopias, why can't they accept our standard models, prefabricated, provided, and priced by official society itself? We may bemoan their apathy, but surely this is better than having them turn up in hundreds at May Day and shout us down or make awkward comments about, quote, Vietnam or, quote, MP salaries, end quote, or, quote, old age pensioners, end quote, or other unpleasant subjects. The press, although aware of the newsworthiness of the esoteric, is less concerned about getting facts straight. The press worship at the altar of power. The press are the mouthpieces of those who have arrived. And these marchers are getting nowhere. They are all, quote, weird, end quote, anyway. Why bore our readers and tax our own gray matter by going into their beliefs more fully? Our political vocabulary is limited. Our knowledge of sects' autonomy excuse me, our political vocabulary is limited, our knowledge of sex anatomy are more limited still. We have so consistently got things wrong when venturing to the left of the Communist Party that we had better keep to safe ground. So let's tidy up reality a little. Let's just call them all, quote, beatniks, quote, anarchists, the, quote, lunatic fringe, end quote. After all, Gateskill called them, quote, peanuts, or Gateskill called them, quote, peanuts, end quote. And what about the demonstrators themselves? The, quote, Balkanization, end quote, of their respective utopias is too obvious to deny. Geography and history get muddled. For some, Mecca is Moscow. For others, Peking. Some live in Petrograd in 1917, others in Barcelona in 1936. Internationals and ideologies interpenetrate. Revolutionary gods, Marx, Bakunin, Luxemburg, Malatesta, De Leon, Lenin, and Trotsky, jostle one another on the narrow summits of revolutionary Olympus. The truly godless are also clamoring for room to breathe. For some, this fragmentation has solely negative aspects. These groups echo the views of the powers that be. Dissent should be centralized, coordinated, channeled along the lines of one particular revolutionary development, which they alone, of course, have grasped. Everything else is diversion and irrelevance. They alone are the conscious agents of an almighty historical providence. They alone have understood the, quote, laws, end quote, of history. They alone are carried forward by the historical flood tide. Such groups are elitist to the core. They and they alone are potential leaderships. Other groups are dangerous competitors in the permanent auction for revolutionary clientele. The masses by themselves can do nothing. They are but an amorphous infantry at the disposal of a self-appointed general staff of revolutionary generals. That ordinary people could themselves make history and could make it in ways unforeseen and unsuspected by the professional revolutionaries would never occur to the residual legatees of Bolshevism. History is thus turned upside down. Monolithic conceptions of the road to, quote, utopia, end quote, foreshadow utopias in their own image, i.e. monolithic to the core. For others in the movement, quote, men make their own history, end quote, and in ways much wider and fuller than is usually conceded. There is no one road to utopia, no one organization or prophet or party destined to lead the masses to the promised land. There is no one historically determined objective, no single vision of a different and new society, no solitary economic panacea that will do away with the alienation of man from his fellow men and from the products of his own activity. For groups holding such views, the, quote, balkanization of utopia, end quote, need convey no disparaging overtones of incapacity or futility. Established society is being corroded at many points in many ways here and now. Hundreds of thousands are contributing to the process, both consciously and otherwise. Brick-planting policemen and lying labor politicians, young people rejecting traditional sexual morality, and students questioning the categorical imperatives of death, quote, for queen and country, end quote, train robbers and, quote, spies for peace, end quote, evading arrest month after month, and well-paid trade union officials pontificating about the merits of an, quote, incomes policy, end quote, for their members. All are playing a worthy part in a vast and essential process of demystification. So are South Bank clergymen degodding God and Catholic priests acting as salesmen for Durex. So are Trots still building left wings in the Labour Party and calling on Labour leaders to legislate for workers' control, while Labour MPs vote themselves a £30-a-week wage increase and thunder against those who, quote, rock the boat, end quote. So are French Stalinists supporting the de Gaulle and Chinese Stalinists supporting the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. Negroes exposing the whole fraudulent nature of the American judicial system, and the White House politicians showing the world their notion of the, quote, rule of law, end quote, in the Dominican Republic. So too, finally, are workers at Paisley using sit-in tactics and having to be carried out by the police, while labor leaders lambast latent Luddites, confer baronetcies on the Brockways and Soppers of this world, confer baronetcies on the Brockways and Soppers of this world, and encourage the half-pissed platitudes of, quote, Brother and, quote, Brown. Brockway is somebody. I think I read an article about left socialism in Britain, and I can't remember what the left socialist party was. That was like to the left of the Labour Party. It was either the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, or I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it was called the Left Socialist Party. I think Brockway was part of that, but I can't be certain. So just pretend I didn't say anything. For those who hold that mass consciousness, rather than a change of leadership, is an essential precondition of social change, the events of the last few years can be viewed with reasonable satisfaction. Starting from very different premises, various groups are making fundamental critiques of established society. Some have been through the mill of traditional, quote, left, end quote, politics, others not. Some start from their experience in production, others from their experience in the anti-bomb movement, some from the total crisis of culture and values in the ad mass society, and others still from the void of their own daily lives. These critiques are slowly converging. They are literally plowing up every acre of established thinking, including the so-called revolutionary ideologies. They are preparing a resurgence of libertarian thought and action based in more genuinely socialist objectives than at any previous period of history. The era of closed ideologies, including the totalitarian, quote, revolutionary, end quote, ideologies, is slowly coming to an end. The cults of efficiency, of hierarchy, of production for production's sake, of consumption for consumption's sake, of organization for organization's sake, of, quote, ever more, end quote, of the same, are slowly being subverted and replaced by genuinely human values. The, quote, Balkanization of Utopia, end quote, bemoaned by bourgeois and Bolsheviks alike, is therefore neither tragedy nor farce, is the sole guarantee that, quote, Utopia, end quote, if we ever get near to it, will be worth living in. Solidarity, Volume 3, Issue 9, June 1965.